my dad's childhood is because he didn't like to talk about it. From what I gathered, it wasn't easy for him. He grew up being able to take care of himself and being able to figure out how to survive.
While at a local festival, romance starts to blossom.
I do remember a story that was told to me of how they got together as a couple, where my dad saw my mom at a local festival and deciding that he was going to be the one to dance with her. My mom had a bunch of gentlemen callers that also wanted to dance with her, but he said to them, I'll be the one that she decides to dance with last.
He was the one that started pursuing her at first. He did what he could to get her to go out with him, to be his girlfriend, but they put a pause on things because mom was going to come back over to the United States.
But my dad was so in love with my mom that when she came over, he followed her here. For all he knew, he could come over and my mom would have been like, it's over. But he took the risk. He went through the Rio Grande. He had to swim over, and then from there, figured out transportation to where he needed to go.
They found their way back to each other. Things progressed very quickly to the point where my dad was going to my grandparents and asking them for permission to get married. I don't really remember him being there.
They were concerned about finances, but we were never without. Because while my dad would be away learning how to fix cars, my mom, she would do those odd jobs, and all the while carrying around 3 kids.
I think it was very tricky to make sure that they were still having time together once he was focusing more on work.
By 1998, the Bahena Quintero family are settled in Carpentersville, Illinois, when Francisca gets suspicious of who Javier is spending his time with.
My dad was a little ladies' man, and my mom, she started getting suspicious of the fact that he was staying so late at work and finding some reason to not come home right away. She did not shy away from saying what she needed to say, but I don't think she ever expected him getting physical with her. The story I was told about the incident that took place in 1998 was she was ironing his clothes so he could go out, and they got into an argument verbally, and it progressed to him hitting her. And I believe she managed to turn around, and in turning around, she scratched him, which kind of just added fuel to the fire. So at that point, he did throw a punch, and it hit her in the face. My mother reacted and tried to get away from him, and police were called. She ended up going to get stitches. He had to go to jail.
Javier is charged with the domestic battery of Francisca and spends a night in jail. 18 days later, he pleads guilty to the attack and is given a conditional release to complete a 26-week counseling program. Francisca believes he has changed and takes him back.
I think the worry is always there with anyone who comes over from Mexico to the United States illegally, that at any point, you could be caught and be sent back.
I can only imagine how the atmosphere must have been after she took him back. But we were better for it to grow up with a dad, because he did care about us a lot. My father is a human being with several faces, and we got to see the father face, but my mom got to see something else.
"18 months after Javier attacks Francisca, he assaults her again.
I learned as a teenager to call the police because he had physically assaulted her. For my dad, obviously, he's thinking of what's going to happen, what's going to be the fallout of this. Because as soon as you get caught by the police, your name's in the system. So I'm giving a false ID to the police, I think was his way of trying to avoid being found out or immigration being called.
Javier pleads guilty to the domestic battery of Francisca and receives a sentence of 3 days in jail and 18 months probation. But for a second time, Francisca takes him back.
My mom wasn't going to quit on her marriage or, her family, even if it wasn't the best thing to do. I think she thought she could handle the abuse. I think she thought that it wasn't going to get beyond that point. So she more internalized whatever she was feeling at that moment and just put us first. This is my sister's birthday party in the middle of a park, and, someone would either be playing music or singing and making music. My mom was always big on pictures too, but I think my dad had given her the idea, hey, we should just start recording all the good memories. When I think of my childhood, it's just the happy singing, spending time with family, very easygoing. I remember multiple times over the years, we would just sit in the living room together, pop in the cassette tapes and just watch them all. And talk about how cute we were, how annoying I was.
7 months later, immigration officials deport Javier. Life continues in Illinois for Francisca and their children.
And my early memories are with my mom rather than my dad. And I played a tour guide and gave false information about every single animal. There are times where my mom just goes over to an animal and just records the animal, which tells me that she was having fun too. I think the fact that my dad worked a lot made it so that when he was deported, it wasn't that big of an event in my young mind.
At this point, I wasn't aware of anything going on. I was at the age, being the youngest, where I was already in preschool or kindergarten. And as a mother of 3 kids by herself, I think she did what she needed to do. I think she was able to keep her head up and, try to make things happen for us.
Within days of his deportation, Javier slips back into Illinois to awaiting Francisca.
I think she was very uneasy with how things were going to play out. But at the end of the day, he was still her husband. A lot of our family did not know the details of what happened. They were given some fabricated story of the reason why he was gone. So I think it was easier for him to be let back into the family with open arms when he did come back. And he was very charismatic. He was very easygoing around my mom's family.
As Javier's birthday comes around, Francisca puts on a show. But times are tough with both of them being undocumented.
Para los nervios. Cuando esté nervioso ya.
I can only imagine that if his work was limited before, it was more limited now. If word got to the wrong person that he was here, there was really nothing we could do to stop him from being sent back.
Javier and Francisca struggle to hide their discontent.
Cálmate, después de eso, porque no van a descubrir que comemos bien feo. Va a haber reclamos, puede haber reclamos,
There were moments when there was tension or when there were arguments, and that is around the time when we actually start moving a little bit more.
We moved up to Burlington for a little bit, but then we uprooted from Burlington. He didn't find out until we got back into the car. When we got back, he was asking my mom, "Where's my beer?" I mentioned that I took it out of the cart, and I remember him just looking around angry. He asked me to hand him my Game Boy, which I had at the time, and he took it and then he slammed it into the car door next to him, enraged. I think it did get to the point where he felt like he needed alcohol, especially at parties.
There was one specific time I remember it was really late at night. My dad had been drinking, my mom was driving, and they had gotten into an argument about something. And my dad reaches over and kind of smacks her in the arm. I remember my mom saying, "The kids are in the car. You don't need to be doing that right now. Like, leave me alone." It made me see my dad in a different way. It made me see their relationship differently.
Never noticed that. How much he stayed around my mom.
He's being very handsy. If she moved somewhere, he was right behind her. I think that side of him started to come out more even without alcohol being involved. But when he was drinking, it was magnified times 10, and he definitely had more of like a machista, which is very like possessive, very controlling way of handling her and kind of handling situations. And from this point on, I'd say all of his bad qualities started to come out.
New Year's Eve 2009. Francisca celebrates turning 37 with her family.
One big hug. I knew a lot of things here. They definitely had problems. They definitely were not okay. She always made a speech.
Traten siempre de ser felices, porque cuando uno es feliz, todo se ve diferente.
It's that last bit that really hit me, where she says that, "Please try to be happy, because when you're happy, everything looks different." It's not something one would typically say during that time.
Les deseo mucha suerte y que Dios los bendiga, que Dios les dé muchas cosas buenas, mucha salud, mucho amor. Yo también te quiero.
My dad, at some point, says, "And I love you too," which didn't escape my notice there.
A month later, at the end of a family party, Javier turns on Francisca.
It's his usual case of my dad roughhousing. And my mother usually doesn't approve of that.
You can even just see her hitting him in the back, like, "Let up." Yeah, my mom was absolutely not okay with this behavior. The dynamic was switching, and he wasn't getting away with as much as he had gotten away with in the past. This woman he had married that he had put through all these things and had forgiven him and had put up with so much, was finally getting to this breaking point that he didn't think she'd ever get to.
I remember her bringing us all to the living room. She said that she wanted to separate from my dad. At that time, I didn't accept it. I think the words I said was, think before you do something that you will regret. That was a terrible thing to say, especially to her. I think my mom took my words to heart. They stayed together for a little bit longer after that.
Quiero decirles que lo más importante es la familia. Por favor, traten de estar unidos todo el tiempo. Todos, familia.
For the next 4 years, Francisca tries to make her relationship with Javier work.
I think a big factor of why she stayed with him, and I think a reason that I heard as well growing up for why she had put up with it so much, was because of us. But it got to the point where the three of us were almost hyper aware of how uncomfortable she was getting. When she started sleeping in my bed or my sister's room was a big eye-opener. This isn't one of those times where they're sitting us down and telling us they're breaking up. Like, this is getting serious to the point my mom doesn't feel safe.
There were rumors of my dad being unfaithful. I think my mom just had it. I think that was it. That kind of pushed it over the edge.
Things were getting very tense at home, and that's more when his kind of obsessive behavior with her started coming out. It was just a constant, what are you doing? What is she doing? I want to talk to her, let me talk to her, and just not leaving her alone. In February of 2014, it got to a point where we needed to leave.
1 month later, Francisca takes Evelyn to California.
A big factor as to why I moved to San Diego was her feeling like her life was in danger. He was threatening her. He was, saying, if you're not with me, you're not going to be with anyone. And he had contacted his family in California to try to find her.
He was actually threatening my mother at this point with taking her life if he could. I wanted to believe that it was a joke, but she had heard from a family member that he had hired somebody to track her and find her and, deal with her. And once she heard about that, then she made sure to just never be alone.
Francisca decides her only option is to return to Illinois.
We ended up moving back because my mom could not feel comfortable being away from my brother and my sister for so long, especially with the behavior that he was exhibiting. And I think that's when things definitely took a turn. Shortly after my 18th birthday was when, for whatever reason, she decided to give him another chance. And I think maybe a part of it was just to get him to stop with the threats. That was the point where I decided I was going to wash my hands of the situation and stop getting involved. And I could not wrap my head around why, after everything we had gone through, she would take him back. I stopped talking to my mom, I stopped talking to my dad. I would just keep in contact with my brother and my sister. I know their reconciliation was very brief. I think my mom realized she had made a big mistake. Friday, March 20th, I had my sister reach out. I needed to come to the hospital. My mom needed me. My uncle was in the ICU. He had suffered a heart attack and he was in critical condition. Knowing my mom, and I knew she was going through it.
I went with my mom that Friday. She wanted to know if he was okay. But on Sunday morning, I was told that my uncle had passed. My father was there that day. And I do feel like he was stalking her at that point.
My dad was just kind of there watching over my mom. And he managed to get my mom into the bathroom.
What is this emergency?
Yes, we had a woman, a visitor that was stabbed in the chest with a screwdriver by her ex-husband in our critical care waiting area.
Where's the ex-husband at?
I have no idea. We're trying to deal with the woman here.
We were told the offender, Javier, was still on site and was currently being detained by security. So officers get there as soon as they possibly can and get him in custody. At the same time, hospital staff started to render aid to Francisca.
We understood that there was an altercation between Francisca and Javier in the bathroom, and that the family members who were at the hospital for a separate family member heard them screaming, trying to get in. They couldn't, and then Javier came out and she had been stabbed.
Officers take Javier into custody and act quickly to secure the scene, but it's already been disturbed.
Before our evidence officers can process it, hospital staff began cleaning up the crime scene, taking away a lot of the blood evidence that may have been there. But this made things more difficult for us because things were not in the exact places they were when it happened.
Officers race to secure the remaining evidence before any more is lost.
The offender had plunged the screwdriver into the wall when he came out of the bathroom. Somebody could easily have gone and taken it out. So the officer made the decision to secure it so nobody else could touch it or grab it.
Officers now turn their attention towards Javier.
We knew Javier was married to Francisca, but we did not know much about his background. So we did run his criminal history, and we found that he had been arrested for domestic battery, that he was in the country illegally, and he had been deported before. So the hospital staff took Francisca to the emergency room to start working on saving her life. But unfortunately, they could not save her.
This is now a murder investigation.
I remember driving to the hospital, and I remember walking in and just seeing it littered with all of my mom's family. And nobody would look at me, like people were just crying, so I was like, okay, I'll just go look for her. I get to the outside of the chapel, and my aunt comes out and meets us right in front. And I remember hugging my aunt, and I asked her, do you know where my mom is? My aunt grabbed me by my arms, and she looked me in my eyes, and she told me that my mom was with God. And in that moment, I kept asking for my dad.
Doubt murder and not something that was a spur of the moment thing. We had enough witnesses, we had enough information that he was the perpetrator. We just wanted to know why, and only he could tell us what exactly occurred behind that closed door. About 3:20 p.m., we went in for our first interview. He seemed a little cold, almost like he didn't care. But he had no problem talking to us. He knew he was caught, so I think that just helped him decide, you know what, I'm just going to tell him kind of what happened. And he had quite a few details of everything before and after the bathroom. He told us he needed to go out to his truck, and he took her phone with him. And he started scrolling through it. It was then that he saw some messages and believed she was cheating on him. He then came back inside with the screwdriver from the truck in his pocket. At which point he motioned for her to come to the bathroom so he can confront her with her phone. Then he blacked out. Next thing he knew, she was on the ground. He just couldn't get himself to say, I stabbed her. He showed no remorse. He showed no concern about her well-being. It took a while for him to actually ask us, hey, how's my wife doing? And that's when we told him she's dead. That's when he broke down crying and just said, do whatever you want to do.
Security footage shows Javier's movements prior to Francisca's killing.
Video surveillance shows him leaving from the lobby out to the parking lot and then coming back, coming off the elevator to the CCU unit, hand in his pocket, presumably with the screwdriver, and then going around the hallway out of view of the camera, which is towards where the bathroom was. He was walking normally, acting normally, didn't appear in distress, but nothing on that corridor was captured by video surveillance.
Officers now turn to digital forensics.
We want to search through the phones to see any communications between the two of them and the communications between Francisca and who she was speaking with, which was what Javier was looking at. She was speaking to another man in relation to her brother passing away. I don't know if he knew who she was speaking with, but maybe because it was another man, that's what triggered him. That just shows me how controlling he is, how insecure he is, how jealous he is. Essentially, he confessed, but he didn't use the words. He was just kind of resigned to the fact that he was done. He went and sat in his truck for about an hour, looking through her phone, thinking about this before he went in, brought her into a bathroom, and started arguing with her. This isn't something that just happened in a spur of a moment where he saw something and then immediately took out a weapon and attacked her. It was a premeditated murder. So our state's attorney decided at that point to give us the first-degree murder charge.
Javier contests the charges.
The first initial court date, I remember feeling the need to be there so he can see me, so he can see what he did, so he can realize that this is real. And I remember seeing him and not recognizing the man that I was staring at. It wasn't the man that had raised me, that I had grown up knowing my whole life, who I loved. I was staring at a complete stranger. I think for a year or so was just, court date, presenting evidence, him pleading not guilty, him continuing to plead not guilty, and us kind of having to relive everything that happened. It got to a point where I think they offered him 2 plea deals, and he said no. He thought he could go to court and win with saying that it was manslaughter. There was so much evidence leading up to this being very premeditated. There's absolutely no way he was going to get manslaughter. So I made the decision to go see him. He never brought up our mom. He never brought up what happened. He was playing a character, like, oh, how are you guys? Like as if nothing had happened. We told him that he needed to take this plea deal because there was absolutely no way he was getting anything less. And continuing to put us through this every single month was just prolonging this process. After talking to him, his attorney called and let us know he was going to be taking the plea deal. We weren't going to have to go to trial, and everything was going to be done.
April 24th, 2017. Javier Bahena pleads guilty to the first-degree premeditated murder of Francisca Quintero.
I think every homicide investigation is a shocking incident. I think this was as close to a public execution as...
Through it, you don't think about worst case scenario. You don't think that that's actually going to happen to you. I think if anyone can learn anything and just take anything away from her story, is that there's always someone who can help you. There's always resources that you think might not be available for you, and they are. And all it takes is you deciding that you're done, and you'll be okay.
I would like to remember her as not only an influential figure in my life, but also a reason that we can be whoever we want to be.
I think about her every day, and the way she would light up a room, the way she would just make you feel so loved and so comfortable.
My mom, Francisca Quintero, was not the perfect person. But she didn't have to be. She was perfect for us, for our kids. That's what mattered.
Seattle did not wake up to the Green River case all at once. It arrived the way certain nightmares do. First as a rumor, then as a headline, then as a silence that began to settle over highways, truck stops, bus shelters, and the ragged edges of the city where people could disappear without the world stopping to notice. In the early 1980s, the Pacific Northwest still carried its familiar image of wet evergreens, low clouds, blue water, and tidy neighborhoods where porch lights glowed through rain. But south of downtown, beyond the polished postcards and ferry views, there were stretches of asphalt and industrial lots where the air smelled of gasoline, river mud, cigarette smoke, and old metal. Along Pacific Highway South, neon signs hummed through mist. Motels with thin walls faced the road. Cars rolled in and out at all hours. Headlights skimmed over puddles, and young women stood under flickering signs, arms folded against the cold, watching traffic slow, hesitate, and choose. On certain nights, the rain came down in a fine gray sheet, so light it seemed harmless until it soaked through denim, curled hair, and chilled fingers to the bone. It was in that world, in those margins, that one of the darkest hunting grounds in American criminal history took shape, long before the country knew the name Gary Ridgway. Long before detectives filled conference rooms with maps and victim lists, there was only a gathering unease. A sense that something was wrong in a way no one had yet measured. Girls were going missing. Some were teenagers. Some had run from homes that had already broken them in quieter ways. Some were mothers. Some had learned to smile through fear because fear did not pay for a room, a meal, or a ride out of the rain. They vanished between one passing car and the next, between an empty promise and a last sighting, between midnight and dawn. And at first, the world answered with the ugliest kind of indifference, the kind that grows whenever the missing come from places society has already decided not to see. Families called and waited. Friends whispered names to each other under sodium streetlights. Detectives took reports, sorted fragments, chased one lead after another, and slowly realized they were not looking at isolated tragedies. They were staring into a pattern, somewhere in the dark ribbon of roads between Seattle and Tacoma. Someone was picking women up, driving them away, and leaving nothing behind but absence. The fear did not spread in one dramatic explosion. It moved through the county in half-heard warnings and the habits people adopted without admitting why. Women memorized license plates when they could. They leaned into car windows and studied drivers with sharper eyes. Other women stopped working alone. Parents who had not spoken to daughters in months suddenly called just to hear breathing on the other end of the line. Detectives drove the strip at night and saw how exposed everything really was. The motels looked temporary, even when people had lived in them for years. The girls looked young, even when the paperwork said adult. The road itself seemed to erase details, in rain and darkness. Every passing sedan became just another shape. Every stranger was another face lit for a second by red brake lights. Then gone. That was the terror at the center of this story. Not only violence, but vanishing. Not only murder, but the way a human life could be swallowed by a landscape that kept moving as if nothing had happened. The Green River case would become famous for numbers, for lists of victims, for the almost mechanical repetition of death. But numbers flatten what fear feels like. Fear is a mother standing in a kitchen at 2 in the morning, touching the cord of a wall phone, waiting for it to ring. Fear is a detective pulling on a damp jacket before sunrise because another body has been found. Fear is a young woman on the side of the highway noticing that a customer smiles too little or too much, and realizing too late that she has misread the face. By the time the name Green River became attached to the investigation, the place itself had already entered local imagination as something colder than geography. The river ran through King County like a vein of dark water, overlooked in places, industrial in others, bordered by brush, embankments, gravel, and discarded things. It was not the kind of landscape that inspired poetry at first glance. It was workaday, muddy, utilitarian. Yet it became a graveyard. Bodies began to appear near its banks, in clusters, in patches of overgrowth where blackberries tangled around debris and the earth held the sweet, rotten smell of decay. Searchers pushing through those areas learned the texture of horror in practical terms. The snag of branches against sleeves, the sucking sound of boots in wet soil, the sudden stop when a shape in the underbrush was not trash after all. You can measure a case like this through evidence, through dates, through forensic reports, but if you want to understand its weight, you have to begin with the atmosphere that formed around it. King County in those years felt like a place looking over its shoulder. News reports stacked up, missing posters circulated. The faces of young women, some smiling in school photos, some caught in worn snapshots, began to blur together in the public mind, even as each family clung desperately to the specifics that made one daughter different from another. One had a crooked grin, one loved horses. One carried too much guilt for being young. One kept promising she would come home next week. In the official language of reports, they became victims. Remains, probable links, unidentified, but before that, they were girls who laughed in fast food parking lots. Women who borrowed jackets, daughters who slammed doors, sisters who braided each other's hair, mothers who kissed sleeping children and stepped back into the night because life had cornered them and dawn was still hours away. This is where the story must begin, not with the killer's name, but with the city that let him move through its blind spots. Gary Ridgway did not create those blind spots by himself. He found them. He learned them. He benefited from every assumption people made about whose absence mattered less, whose danger was self-inflicted, whose file could wait until morning. That does not lessen his guilt. It reveals the shape of the ground beneath it. Predators do not hunt in a vacuum. They hunt where indifference has already thinned the walls, and Ridgway, by all accounts, understood that world with a terrible, practical clarity. He was not a shadowy genius writing cryptic letters to newspapers. He was not theatrical. He did not seem carved out of some obvious nightmare. He blended. He looked like the kind of man who could stand in line at a hardware store and disappear into the crowd before anyone remembered his face. That ordinary exterior is one of the most chilling features of the Green River story. Evil here did not announce itself with spectacle. It came home from work. It kept its voice level. Somewhere between the ordinary daylight version of that man and the hidden life he led, a fracture opened wide enough to swallow dozens of women. And because he was so unremarkable on the surface, because his victims were so often dismissed by the culture around them, he lasted. He lasted through task forces, interviews, tips, sketches, rumors, and years of accumulating grief. He lasted while families buried daughters, or worse, waited without bodies to bury. He lasted while detectives carried photographs in their coat pockets, while evidence aged in storage, while witnesses doubted their own memories. The scale of the case would one day shock the nation. But before it became history, it was intimate. It was one woman not coming back, then another. It was a county learning the rhythm of dread. It was police scanners cracking in the night. It was the unspoken calculation women made every time a car slowed beside them, even now. Decades later, the case still carries the feeling of rain on pavement and the hum of tires on a dark road. Because that is how it lived in real time, not as a solved chapter, but as a long season of uncertainty in which the next victim might already be standing under a motel sign, trying to judge the intentions behind a windshield. So before we speak of names, evidence, interviews, confessions, and courtroom reckonings, hold that image for a moment. A roadside at night in King County, a strip of businesses washed in weak neon. A river moving unseen beyond the industrial edges. A girl glancing into a car window and making a decision she believes she can survive. Somewhere nearby, a man is watching with the patience of someone who has done this before. The rain keeps falling. Traffic keeps moving. The city keeps breathing. And in that ordinary, indifferent darkness, one of the deadliest serial murder cases in American history is already underway. What makes the opening of this story so unsettling is that the warning signs were visible, yet never visible enough to force immediate recognition. The women most at risk lived under multiple forms of exposure at once. Many were young. Some were estranged from families. Some were caught in addiction, in unstable housing, in relationships that shifted quickly from dependence to threat. Some moved through juvenile institutions, foster homes, temporary rooms, and cars that doubled as shelter. In another social world, those conditions would have triggered layers of protection. Here, they often became reasons for authorities, employers, strangers, even neighbors to expect chaos and call it normal. When one of these women vanished, too many people had ready-made explanations. She had probably left town. She was probably avoiding somebody. She was probably on a binge. She would turn up. That small word probably can be deadly. It buys time for a killer. It smooths public discomfort. It lets the gap between disappearance and alarm widen until evidence thins, witnesses drift, and the last clear sighting dissolves into weather and memory. In King County, the pattern did not begin as a dramatic cinematic puzzle with obvious connecting threads pinned under bright light. It began the way real disasters usually begin, with separate desks, separate files, separate phone calls, and separate families being told to stay calm while dread quietly hardened into fact. There were moments, too, when the place itself seemed almost to collaborate with secrecy. The Pacific Northwest can be breathtaking. But beauty in that region has a darker twin. The same thick growth that turns hillsides lush can hide remains for months. The same ravines and wooded pull-offs that look peaceful in daylight can become nearly soundless after sunset. Rain softens tracks. Rivers move debris. Dump sites blend into ordinary neglect. A body left in brush or near water could lie within reach of roads, factories, or neighborhoods and still remain unseen until chance, smell, or a search pattern brought human eyes close enough. Detectives on the case would later describe the draining repetition of these recoveries, the sickening possibility that one discovery might lead to several more. Searchers went out with clipboards, evidence bags, radios, and hope that felt thinner each time they stepped into another patch of weeds. Sometimes they found clothing first. Sometimes bones, sometimes almost nothing except the certainty that a life had ended there. Violently and alone, those discoveries changed the emotional temperature of the region. Fear became more concrete once the missing were no longer only missing, the dead had been placed somewhere. Someone had carried them there. Someone knew these back roads, these embankments, these forgotten spaces beside the machinery of daily life. That knowledge suggested habit, and habit suggested repetition. A single murder is a wound. Repetition becomes an ecosystem of terror. And still, the man responsible passed through the same county in daylight. Unremarkable enough to remain just another worker in traffic, there is a particular horror in crimes committed by someone who does not need to perform monstrosity because he has learned the camouflage of routine. Ridgway was not the kind of killer who built myth around himself while the crimes were unfolding. He did not send riddles. He did not create a theatrical persona for the public to fear. In some ways, that made him more frightening. Not less. He seemed to understand that attention is dangerous. So he operated in the quiet seam between public neglect and private compulsion. He chose targets whom others often failed to protect. He used a landscape that could absorb evidence. He relied on the fact that a woman entering a stranger's vehicle on Pacific Highway South was participating in an exchange so common it barely registered with anyone passing by. A man slowing his car near a young sex worker at night did not create a scene. It created business. In that thin slice of normalcy, he could begin the process that ended in death. And perhaps that is why the Green River case still feels so haunting. It shattered not one illusion, but several. It exposed how ordinary roads can become corridors for predation. It exposed how vulnerable women can vanish repeatedly before the full force of concern arrives. It exposed how a serial killer can look less like a monster from fiction and more like a man whose face slips from memory the moment you look away. For the families, the opening chapter was not written in criminal profiles or press conferences. It was written in waiting. It was written in unanswered calls, in ashtrays filling through the night, in fathers driving routes they did not understand, in mothers scanning every arriving car, in siblings listening for footsteps on porches. Hope did not disappear all at once either. It flickered stubbornly. Maybe she had met someone. Maybe she was scared to come home. Maybe she would call when the money ran out. That fragile hope coexisted with another knowledge that no one wanted to name. By the time the county understood it was facing a serial murderer, many families had already lived through the private version of the case. That terrible stretch in which love keeps inventing explanations because the alternative is too immense to hold. This first part is not the place to resolve that tension. It is the place to sit inside it, to feel the rain-soaked roads, the institutional blind spots, the slow formation of dread, and the unbearable fact that a killer was learning confidence while a community was still learning the size of the threat. Every case has a moment before the world knows its name. The Green River murders lived in that moment for far too long, and in that delay, the darkness grew teeth quietly. By the time the Green River murders began to carve their way into the consciousness of Washington state, the landscape around Seattle and King County was already carrying the kind of tension that rarely makes it into tourist photographs. On paper, the region looked prosperous, industrious, and almost serene, a place of forests, ferries, Boeing paychecks, suburban subdivisions, and damp morning light settling over the sound. But the early 1980s were not lived on paper. They were lived in layoffs, motel rooms, family fractures, quiet addictions, and long strips of commercial road where the economy of survival ran after dark beneath buzzing neon and the constant hiss of tires on wet pavement. To understand how Gary Ridgway was able to move through that world for so long, you have to begin not with the man himself, but with the environment that shaped his opportunities, the physical and social terrain that kept certain women exposed and certain dangers invisible until the body count became impossible to ignore. South of Seattle, the glossy image of the Northwest gave way to a harsher geography. Pacific Highway South cut through stretches of King County like an artery of commerce and desperation. During the day, it could seem ordinary enough. Lined with used car lots, taverns, convenience stores, repair shops, taverns again, and motels that looked like they had been built for temporary stays and then forgotten by time. But at night, the road changed character. It became a place of transactions measured in quick glances and cash folded into pockets. A place where women stood under weak light, watching cars slow, stop, or circle back. Where truck engines idled outside low-rent rooms and the line between routine and danger was as thin as a rolled-down window. The rain was almost always part of the scene. Not the dramatic thunderstorm rain of other parts of America, but a gray, patient drizzle that soaked through layers and made everything feel colder than the temperature suggested. It blurred brake lights, softened outlines, and gave the whole corridor a kind of tired glow, as if the night itself had not slept in years. In that setting, vulnerability did not look like a single condition. It looked like overlap. Many of the women who moved through the strip were young, some barely out of adolescence, some not fully out of it at all. Some had run from violent homes. Some had been pushed into adulthood before they had the emotional language to understand what had happened to them. Some were using drugs heavily enough that each day became a sequence of urgent calculations rather than a future. Some were mothers, trying to keep custody of children while living in circumstances that made stability nearly impossible. Some drifted between friends, customers, boyfriends, shelters, cars, and rooms rented by the night. The details changed from one life to the next, but the underlying exposure remained the same. Each woman carried her own history, yet the world around her often collapsed that history into a single label and used that label as permission to care less. That was the real setting of the Green River case. Not simply Seattle, not simply King County, but a social geography made up of blind spots. It was a place where absence could be explained away too easily because the missing person had already been treated like she was half absent while still alive. Families knew this. Many of them fought desperately against it. A mother reporting her daughter missing might already hear the assumptions forming on the other side of the desk. Vanish and return. As if danger were just another habit she had chosen, and not a pressure bearing down on her from all sides. That assumption bought the killer time. Every delayed report, every half-serious response, every dismissal that treated a disappearance as lifestyle rather than emergency widened the space in which he could operate. The region itself added another layer. King County was not only urban and suburban, it was also broken by rivers, ravines, wooded embankments, industrial access roads, vacant lots, and dense growth that could swallow evidence in a matter of days. The Green River, winding through much of that area, did not look like a symbol at first. It looked like part of the county's working body. Searway bordered in places by industry, in others by brush and mud and quiet stretches that few people had reason to enter. But once bodies began turning up near it, the river changed in the public imagination. It became something almost mythic. Not because it was mystical, but because it seemed to connect a chain of horrors scattered across ordinary land. Search teams moved through blackberry thickets and undergrowth, and the simple act of stepping off the road took on a dreadful intimacy. The earth was wet, branches clawed at jackets. The smell of river water mixed with rot, oil, and the sweet, sick note of decomposition. You did not have to go far from traffic to reach a place where someone could die unheard. That is one of the most unsettling truths at the center of this story. The killer was not operating in some distant wilderness detached from civilization. He was operating in the folds of civilization, in the places where roads met brush, where commerce met neglect, where a woman could get into a car within sight of passing drivers and still enter a world that would not protect her. Seattle itself, meanwhile, remained a city split between image and underside. There were office towers, neighborhoods with lawns, ferries moving across gray water, and the growing sense of a modern regional hub. But beneath that surface were neighborhoods burdened by poverty, addiction, and displacement. The 1970s and early 80s had left marks across the American landscape, and the Pacific Northwest was no exception. Economic uncertainty and social upheaval had cracked homes open in quiet ways. Mental health systems were patchy. Child protection often failed too late or not at all for many young women who would later become part of the Green River investigation. The story did not begin on Pacific Highway South. It began years earlier in bedrooms where they were not safe, in homes where love was inconsistent, in schools where they were already slipping through, in institutions that managed them rather than held them. By the time they reached the Strip, they were often carrying the accumulated damage of many smaller abandonments. That history matters because it explains why the setting cannot be reduced to one road or one killer. The setting was a chain of conditions. It included the man driving by with murderous intent, but it also included every room, system, and street that left a young woman vulnerable enough to be there in the first place. Gary Ridgway emerged from another branch of that same landscape. Though in a form that to outside observers looked far more stable, he was, in many ways, frighteningly ordinary on the surface. He worked. He lived in the community. He knew the roads. He understood where police patrolled, where traffic thinned, where a person could be taken without drawing attention. There was no dramatic Gothic aura around him in daily life. He did not stride through the city trailing legend. He fit, and that ability to fit is essential to the background of the case. The public likes villains who appear monstrous from a distance because they confirm a comforting lie, the lie that danger announces itself clearly. Ridgway did not offer that comfort. He moved through the same weather, the same roads, the same economy, and the same routines as everyone else. He did not need a lair. He needed familiarity. He needed the confidence that comes from knowing the terrain better than the people trying to survive within it. If the Strip was the most visible stage of his hunting, then anonymity was the curtain that kept him hidden. Night after night, cars slowed beside women who had seconds to make a judgment. A customer might be rude, nervous, drunk, lonely, silent, talkative, or strange. Men came and went constantly. That was the business. It is easy in hindsight to imagine obvious warning signs. But hindsight is a luxury the living do not get. In the moment, a woman standing in cold rain did not choose between safety and danger in any grand moral sense. She chose between one car and another, one face and another, one risk and the need to eat, sleep indoors, or buy the next dose that would keep sickness away. Ridgway understood this compressed economy of decision. He understood that he was approaching women who had to make fast choices in bad conditions. Women whom society had already burdened with too much and would later fail to defend with enough urgency. The social atmosphere of the time also shaped how the murders were received. America in the early 80s was fascinated by serial killers in the abstract and often indifferent to their victims in practice, especially when those victims were poor, addicted, sexually exploited, young, or all four at once. News coverage could swing between alarm and subtle contempt. Public fear grew, but not always as compassion. There was a tendency to treat the women on the Strip as symbols of urban decline rather than as daughters and mothers with names, favorite songs, childhood stories, bad tempers, private jokes, and rooms they once decorated. That flattening effect was one of the case's cruelest background conditions. The killer reduced the women to bodies. Society had often reduced them to types even before that. Their families, by contrast, fought to hold on to individuality with desperate force. They remembered birthdays, scars, habits, nicknames, school pictures, the way a daughter used to run down a hallway, the songs she sang off-key, the days she promised she would get clean, the nights she came home smelling like rain and cigarettes. In those memories, the victims remained whole even as the investigation began to absorb them into files, evidence lists, and forensic charts. The tension between those two ways of seeing people, as singular lives or as categories, formed a quiet but crucial part of the setting. It affected how quickly the alarm spread and how long it took for the full human scale of the catastrophe to register. Law enforcement, too, was operating inside the limitations of its era. Serial murder investigations in the early 80s did not have the forensic reach that later generations would take for granted. DNA profiling was not yet the decisive tool it would become. Cases relied heavily on witness memory, physical evidence vulnerable to weather and time, patterns that had to be recognized by human attention. An enormous labor carried out by detectives who often had too many names, too many leads, and too little certainty in a region where disappearances could be explained away and bodies might surface far from where a woman was last seen. Even recognizing the shape of a serial case required persistence. Once the pattern was recognized, the investigation would become massive, but in the beginning, the background itself worked against clarity. The women moved in a transient environment. Many used aliases. Some were estranged from families who might not know where to begin looking. Some had no stable address. Some trusted men they should not have trusted because trust was currency and suspicion could cost survival. When they vanished, the trail often began already frayed. That is why part 2 of this story must linger here, in the setting, before the narrative races into discovery and investigation. Without this backdrop, the Green River case risks becoming just another inventory of horrors attached to a killer's name. With it, the case becomes what it truly was: a collision between one man's sustained predation and a community structured in ways that made predation easier than it should ever have been. Picture King County in those years as a map of contrasts. Evergreen hills and muddy pull-offs, factory shifts ending as sex workers began another night. Family homes lit warmly against a sky that darkened before evening felt finished. Taverns where men drank under yellow light, then drove slowly down the strip, motel doors opening and closing. The murmur of a police radio, the smell of wet wool, coffee gone stale on a dashboard, cigarette ash tapped out a cracked window. Somewhere a girl laughs too loudly because fear hates silence. Somewhere a detective pins another photograph to a board already growing crowded. Somewhere a man who looks forgettable is learning, with each successful murder, how long the world can take to understand what he is. That was the background. That was the stage, not a single dramatic location, but an entire atmosphere built from weather, roads, poverty, indifference, survival, and the dangerous ordinary rhythm of nights along Pacific Highway South. Before the river gave the case its name, the county had already given it its conditions. And in those conditions, under rain and neon and the dull roar of constant traffic, a predator found room to become one of the deadliest serial killers in American history long before the Green River case was defined by maps, body recovery sites, and the cold arithmetic of victim counts. It was defined by young women whose lives were far larger than the worst thing that happened to them. That matters here, because serial murder has a way of stealing identity twice. The killer takes the life, and history, if it is careless, takes the person, flattening her into a single line in a documentary. A photograph pinned beside dozens of others, a name spoken only in the same breath as a monster. But the women Gary Ridgway targeted did not begin as victims. They began as daughters with winter coats hung over chairs, teenagers with stubborn streaks, children who once ran through backyards, girls who laughed too hard in school hallways, young mothers rocking babies in dim apartments, sisters borrowing sweaters, friends making promises they meant in the moment, even if life later made those promises hard to keep. If this story is to have any moral center, then part 3 must stay with them long enough for the audience to feel what was taken. Not in abstract tragedy, but in human texture. Many of the women linked to Ridgway were painfully young. Some were still teenagers when they vanished. Suspended in that fragile phase of life when a person can look almost grown from a distance but is still carrying the rawness of childhood under the surface. Their records would later list ages, last seen dates, locations, and physical descriptions: brown hair, blonde hair, height, weight, clothing. But those details are not the same as a life. A life is messier. A life is a girl changing her mind every week about what kind of future she wants. A life is a daughter saying she hates her mother, then coming back hungry 2 days later and eating at the kitchen counter without apology because anger and love are still tangled together. A life is a teenager wanting tenderness and excitement at the same time, reaching for adulthood before she has been given the tools to survive it. Some of these women had already been bruised by the world long before Ridgway ever drove past them. Abuse, neglect, instability, addiction, exploitation, and the simple bad luck of being born into chaos had narrowed their options year by year. But narrowed is not the same as erased. They still had tastes, loyalties, private hopes, and versions of themselves that existed beyond the streets where they were later judged and hunted. There were girls who loved music loud enough to drown out thought. Girls who still carried stuffed animals longer than other people expected. Girls who liked cheap perfume, bright lipstick, second-hand jackets, and the momentary magic of feeling seen. Some had children they loved fiercely, even when their own lives had become too unstable to hold those children safely. Some had parents who had failed them in certain years and still could not stop loving them. Some had siblings who remembered who they were before everything went wrong, before the drugs, before the arrests, before the road, before the long absences that made every reunion feel provisional. To say that many of Ridgway's victims were vulnerable women is true, but it is also incomplete. Vulnerability can sound passive, as if it were a natural trait. In reality, much of their vulnerability had been manufactured by the world around them. It had been shaped by violent homes, by institutions that processed them instead of protecting them, by men who took what they wanted, by poverty that pressed every decision into urgency, by addiction that turned the body into a negotiation, by a culture that looked at certain young women and saw trouble before it saw pain. When those women stepped onto Pacific Highway South, some of them were trying to survive one more night, one more week, one more withdrawal, one more debt, one more terrible boyfriend, one more motel bill, one more stretch before they could somehow reset their lives. Many probably still believed, in flashes, that a reset was possible. That is one of the most heartbreaking truths in cases like this. People can be in desperate circumstances without surrendering the idea of a future. A woman can stand in rain beside a highway and still imagine getting clean next month, finding an apartment, seeing her child again, going back to school, reconciling with her family, leaving a man who frightens her, becoming someone steadier than the version of herself she currently inhabits. That future may look fragile to outsiders. To her, it can still feel real enough to keep moving toward. The victim's story, then, is not only a story of danger, it is a story of interrupted motion. These were lives in progress. Some had recently left home. Some had recently returned to it. Some were drifting between names and places. But drifting is not the same as being empty. Even women who lived with addiction had routines, friendships, preferences, inside jokes, ways of taking coffee, ways of tucking hair behind the ear when nervous, ways of sounding on the phone that let mothers know immediately whether things were getting worse or almost better. Families remembered these details long after the public learned only the broad outline. They remembered birthdays that arrived after the disappearance and filled the house with a silence no cake could survive. They remembered drawers still holding makeup, letters, old school papers, tiny things that proved a person had expected to come back for them. They remembered arguments frozen midstream, cruel words no one had time to apologize for, the special torment of knowing the final conversation had been ordinary when ordinary would later become unbearable. In true crime, there is always a temptation to rush toward the killer because the killer offers momentum. The victims require patience. They require us to slow down enough to understand that they were not interchangeable. Even when the killer treated them as if they were, consider what it means for a family to lose a daughter whose life had already become difficult to track. Love in those circumstances is not neat. It is often mixed with exhaustion, resentment, guilt, fear, and failed attempts to rescue. Parents may have threatened tough love. Daughters may have disappeared for days before and come back angry, high, defensive, ashamed, or all at once. Brothers and sisters may have stolen from one another, lied for one another, covered for one another, and still felt a fierce protective instinct no matter how chaotic things became. Then the disappearance happens, and every previous conflict turns poisonous in memory. The mind begins to bargain with time. If I had answered differently, if I had insisted she stay, if I had driven that route sooner, if I had checked the motel, if I had not assumed she would turn up again. This is part of the victim's story too, because serial murder ripples through everyone left behind. And in the Green River case, those ripples spread through homes already carrying too much grief. Some of the women had no stable room of their own. But that does not mean no one was waiting for them. Somewhere, there was almost always somebody keeping a portion of hope alive. A mother staring through blinds at night, a friend listening for a knock, a child too young to understand absence except as a change in routine, a father driving slowly through neighborhoods he did not know how to enter, looking for a face that might dart out of a doorway, and because so many of the victims lived in unstable circumstances, the search for them often began in confusion. Which friends had seen her last? Which name had she been using? Which man was she staying with? Which motel? Which corner? Which county jail? Which clinic? Which rumor was real? A woman could be deeply loved and still difficult to locate. That painful reality became one more advantage for the killer, yet it would be wrong to tell their story only through brokenness. There was resilience in these women too, the hard, bright kind that develops when life has forced someone to improvise for years. They knew how to read people quickly, how to make strangers laugh, how to negotiate, how to endure cold, hunger, humiliation, and sudden swings in fortune. They knew how to create islands of pleasure in ugly places, sharing food in parking lots, leaning against one another in motel rooms, doing each other's makeup in mirrors lit badly enough to forgive anything, even in dangerous environments. People build community. They borrow, warn, gossip, protect, and witness. Women on the strip noticed when another woman had not been seen. They remembered cars. They traded stories about customers who felt wrong. They measured risk using intuition sharpened by repetition. That those instincts could still be defeated does not mean they were foolish. It means the predator they faced understood how to present himself just safely enough, just ordinarily enough, to get past the defenses that danger had already trained into them. One of the deepest cruelties of the Green River murders is that the women's hardest-earned survival skills could not always save them from a man who had made vulnerability his specialty. This part of the story should also confront the language that often surrounds victims like these. When the public hears that many were sex workers, runaways, or drug users, there is a quiet pressure to place them outside the category of innocence. That pressure is moral laziness disguised as realism. A woman does not stop being worthy of grief because she sold sex. A teenager does not become disposable because she ran away. A mother does not cease to matter because addiction entered her bloodstream. The Green River case exposed, with devastating clarity, how hierarchy shapes compassion. Some victims had to fight in death for the dignity they should have received in life. Families and advocates pushed back against that erasure, insisting on names, photographs, and stories that rehumanized the women beyond the labels attached to them. And that insistence matters now, because telling the victim's story properly is an act of restoration. It returns complexity where the killer imposed reduction. It says each woman had a childhood before she had a file. It says each body found in brush or near water belonged to someone who once sat at a table, once laughed at a joke, once believed tomorrow still belonged to her. In many ways, the victim's story is the emotional core of the entire Green River case. Without it, the narrative collapses into criminology and spectacle. With it, every later discovery lands differently. The recovered remains are no longer anonymous evidence. They are somebody's daughter in the earth. The missing poster is no longer just paper. It is a family refusing disappearance. The delay in police response is no longer bureaucratic failure in the abstract. It is time stolen from women who had already had too much taken. When Ridgway preyed on these victims, he was not choosing faceless figures. He was choosing human beings whose lives were complicated enough to be undervalued by the society around them. The case becomes more horrifying, not less, when we understand that truth clearly, because then the loss is not merely numerical. It becomes cumulative human interruption. Dozens of futures snapped mid-sentence. Children grew up without mothers. Parents aged under the weight of never fully healing. Siblings carried images in their heads they could not shake. Communities of women who survived the strip learned to see every silence differently. Even those who were never attacked lived under the pressure of knowing how easily they could have been. The victim's story extends into all of those haunted survivors as well. It lives in the women who kept scanning every slowing car after the murders entered public awareness. It lives in the ones who later testified, remembered, or simply endured. So when we speak of the Green River victims, we should not imagine a line of identical shadows. We should imagine a crowded human gallery of interrupted lives, each one distinct, each one carrying beauty, damage, humor, recklessness, longing, and fear in a different proportion. We should imagine teenagers trying on adulthood like a coat that did not fit, young mothers whispering promises to children they hoped to reclaim, friends huddled in cold parking lots, sharing cigarettes and rumors, daughters who had made every mistake available to them and still deserved mornings, birthdays, and the chance to become older than the case allowed. That is the story the killer tried to erase. That is the story the files could only partially preserve. And that is the story we have to hold on to before the road darkens further. Before the disappearances become bodies, before the investigation turns them into evidence. Because only by seeing them first as living women can we understand the full obscenity of what was done to them. There is another reason to linger with them here. Predators like Ridgway often become the center of narratives because violence creates a false gravity. Everything seems to orbit the person who caused the damage, but if the camera stays on him too long, it begins to inherit his perspective. The better lens is humane. It stays with the women in the ordinary hours before danger. It sees one of them sitting on a motel bed, counting crumpled bills under a lamp. It sees another in a diner booth stirring sugar into burnt coffee, eyes ringed with exhaustion, still laughing at something a friend said minutes earlier. It sees a teenage girl fixing eyeliner in a tiny mirror, trying to look older, tougher, less frightened than she feels. It sees a mother touching a child's photograph kept in a soft wallet. It sees someone stepping outside into cold night air, pulling a jacket closer, scanning traffic, telling herself she will only stay out a little longer. Those moments are not dramatic in the way murder is dramatic. They are more important. They are the last fragile architecture of personhood before a killer tries to turn a human life into an absence. And because many of these women were living in public but rarely being truly seen, remembering them this way becomes a form of witness. Not perfect witness, because no retelling can restore what was lost. But honest witness, honest enough to say they were not saints. Not symbols, not cautionary tales. They were real women in real trouble, carrying tenderness alongside damage. They wanted money, relief, sleep, forgiveness, another chance, a safer man, a quieter mind, a room with a lock, a way back to children, a future that did not feel so narrow. In another world, those wants would have been ordinary. In their world, even hope had to fight for space. That fight is part of who they were, and it deserves to be remembered before everything that follows. The incident, in a case like the Green River murders, never belongs to a single night. It belongs to a sequence. A ritual, a repeated crossing from ordinary motion into irreversible violence. That is what makes this part so difficult to tell with honesty. There is no one final walk down one road. No single victim whose last minutes can stand in for all the others. No neat dramatic scene in which fate announces itself clearly. There were many nights, many cars. Many moments when a woman leaned toward a rolled-down window and saw only a customer, a chance at money, a ride, a possibility of making it through until morning. Somewhere inside those ordinary exchanges, death was waiting with its engine idling. To write Part 4 truthfully is to gather those moments into one sustained portrait of how the crime unfolded, not by inventing certainty where none exists, but by following the rhythm investigators later understood. A woman stood beneath wet neon on Pacific Highway South. Traffic hissed past through rain. Her jacket held the smell of cigarette smoke and damp fabric. Her feet hurt. Maybe she had not eaten enough. Maybe she was sick, exhausted, cold, desperate, defiant, or numb. Maybe she was young enough to still believe she could read men quickly and older than her years in every way that mattered. A car slowed. Headlights brushed over her legs, then steadied. The driver looked ordinary. That was one of the most terrifying parts. He did not need to frighten at first glance. He needed to seem usable. He needed to seem like the kind of man a woman could get into a car with and still come back from. Perhaps he smiled. Perhaps he barely smiled at all. Perhaps he spoke softly. As if there were no reason for alarm, the window came down and warm air from the heater pushed into the night, carrying faint notes of oil, vinyl, stale coffee, or the chemical cleanliness of a car recently wiped down. Money was discussed in short, practical language. A destination was implied, maybe a motel, maybe a nearby road, maybe someplace private but not too far. Someplace the customer claimed he knew, for a woman working the strip. This part of the interaction was routine enough that danger could not always declare itself distinctly. Suspicion lived everywhere. But so did necessity. A bad feeling might mean survival. It might also mean turning away needed cash, so the door opened. Or she opened it herself, and in that small motion the incident began. The city did not pause. Other cars kept moving. Other women kept waiting under other lights. Somewhere music played from a tavern doorway. Somewhere a truck changed gears on wet asphalt. The woman in the passenger seat might have looked once through the side window at the road slipping behind them, measuring distance automatically, noting landmarks the way anyone in a precarious life learns to do. She might have asked a question. She might have settled into silence. Beside her, Gary Ridgway drove with the composure of a man who knew these roads well enough to make unfamiliarity feel brief. The ordinary details are exactly what make the incident so chilling. There was no theatrical threshold. No visible border where daily risk became fatal intent. The road turned. The lights thinned. Businesses gave way to darker stretches, to industrial margins, side roads, gravel pull-offs, patches of brush, or isolated areas where the sound of traffic was present but distant enough to stop mattering. Rain tapped the windshield or moved in silver threads under street lamps. Wipers kept time. The heater hummed. A woman sitting in that passenger seat might still have believed she was inside a transaction she could manage. She had likely been inside hundreds of risky situations already and survived them. That survival record can create its own dangerous logic. Fear loses sharpness through repetition. A man seems tense, then relaxes. A location seems isolated, then the money appears. A customer seems strange, then only awkward. Every previous night trains the body to normalize what should perhaps be refused, because refusal is a privilege not equally distributed. Ridgway exploited that brutal fact. He selected women who had to keep making decisions inside narrowing margins. He did not need them unafraid. He needed them willing enough to stay until he could control the next moment. The exact mechanics varied from victim to victim, but the broad pattern later established was one of intimate, immediate violence. This was not a killer who stood at a distance. He came close. He relied on the proximity created by the transaction itself. The private space of a vehicle or a secluded stop gave him the advantage he wanted: isolation, surprise, control, and the ability to turn a brief encounter into a final one before anyone even realized the woman had vanished. There is something especially horrifying about murder committed in such close quarters. Because closeness is where human signals usually work. We read breath, posture, hesitation, tone. We rely on the nearness of another person to tell us whether the situation can still be steered. In the Green River killings, that nearness became the trap. The woman may have stepped out of the car first, expecting one kind of encounter and entering another. The ground underfoot might have been muddy, uneven, littered with gravel or damp leaves. Perhaps there were trees. Perhaps only brush and darkness. Perhaps the air smelled of wet earth and river water. Perhaps she was already alert now, looking around, recalculating, deciding whether to continue, whether to leave, whether the money justified the place. Then the shift. The attack in Ridgway's case was often by strangulation, a method that feels uniquely personal and terrifying because it involves not just violence but sustained physical domination. It is not chaotic distance. It is pressure, force, hands, breath, resistance, time measured in panic and muscle failure. Even describing it in restrained language leaves the essential obscenity intact, a living person realizing, too late, that the man in front of her has abandoned all pretense. A body fighting instinctively, desperately, for air, the world narrowing into impact. Weight, ground, darkness, noise inside the skull. This is the moment where true crime often becomes exploitative if it is not careful, so it is important to remain disciplined. We do not know every final thought. We do know enough to understand the structure of terror. Surprise, resistance, disbelief giving way to certainty, the savage intimacy of being overpowered by someone who, minutes earlier, was just another driver at the curb. And then, once life was gone, the incident did not end. That is another essential truth. Murder was not only the act of killing, it included what came after. The choices Ridgway made with the body, the cold, practical steps that reveal not impulsive fury alone, but pattern and concealment. He transported victims. He left them in wooded areas, near roads, along embankments, and in places where weather, time, animals, and neglect would damage evidence and delay discovery. In some cases, the remains of multiple women were found in relative proximity, which deepened the horror for investigators and families alike. The dump sites were not grand symbolic stages. They were places chosen because the world did not look closely there. That too is part of the incident. The body of a murdered woman carried into brush by a man who believed the landscape would assist him. Rain falling over fresh concealment, branches bending back into place, tires turning over mud or gravel as he left. Within minutes, the scene might look almost unchanged to anyone passing nearby. Only one person would be missing from the visible world. And for hours, sometimes days, that absence could still be mistaken for movement. Back on the strip, other women continued working. Some may have noticed that someone had not come back. Some may have assumed she found a room, another customer, another corner. Night economies teach people not to panic too early because panic is expensive and often disproven by morning. But the killer benefited from every hour before certainty arrived. Somewhere a friend asked if anyone had seen her. Somewhere a sister waited. Somewhere a mother felt the first pressure of dread in her chest and began the old argument between fear and denial. The incident, then, stretched beyond the physical attack into the first phase of disappearance, that twilight period when a woman is gone but not yet confirmed dead. Few forms of suffering are more corrosive than that interval. A missing person still exists in two worlds at once. In one, she might be alive, just delayed. Hiding, using. Drifting, sleeping somewhere unknown. In the other, she is already beyond rescue, and only the people who loved her have not yet been told by reality which world is true. Ridgway's crimes repeatedly forced families into that cruel uncertainty. To understand the incident fully, we also have to recognize how little spectacle it contained from the outside. This was not a killer smashing through front doors in a shower of broken glass. It was not public violence in the center of a crowd. It was low-visibility predation embedded in routine. That made it easier to repeat. A woman entering a stranger's car on Pacific Highway South did not create a memory in every passing driver. It barely interrupted the scene. In a region already accustomed to seeing sex work as part of the nocturnal landscape, that exchange looked like business, not emergency. By the time anyone recognized the emergency, the car was gone. The turn had been made, the road had emptied, and another life had crossed into private danger. There is a reason serial murder investigations often depend so heavily on patterns. Individual incidents can look small from a distance. One woman missing from one bad stretch of road. One more rumor. One more report delayed by weather. Shame, addiction, or fractured family communication. But when those incidents accumulate, their sameness becomes unbearable. Young women, last seen along the same corridor, similar lifestyles used against them in public imagination. Bodies surfacing in outdoor locations, the killer counting on the fact that each separate disappearance would need time before it joined the others in official thought. In that sense, every incident contained not only one murder, but the seed of the next. Each successful attack taught Ridgway something about timing, about disposal, about how much attention he had drawn or avoided, about which roads felt safe, which methods were efficient, which victims were easiest to isolate, and how long he could continue before the county truly understood the scale of what it was facing. That learning curve is one of the grimmest aspects of the case. Repetition did not simply increase the body count, it refined the killer. If there is any mercy in telling the incident now, decades later, it lies in refusing to let the killer's method become abstract. A pattern can sound mechanical, but each repetition was inflicted on an individual woman whose body registered fear as violently as any body ever has. Each disappearance tore a new gap in a family, a street network, a fragile community of women trying to survive under the same lights. Each attack began with a living person making a practical decision in difficult circumstances and ended with a silence that others had to interpret. That human scale matters more than any dark mythology. The Green River murders were not a legend when they were happening. They were episodes of sudden, intimate violence hidden inside ordinary nights. Imagine one of those nights in full. The air cold enough to sting wet skin, a convenience store glowing at the edge of the road, a girl shifting her weight from one foot to the other, hugging herself between cars, mascara beginning to soften in the mist. She is thinking about money, maybe about food, maybe about a room, maybe about somebody she owes, maybe about nothing beyond the next hour, because that is all her life can afford her to think. A car slows. The man behind the wheel looks plain, maybe even cautious. She gets in. The door shuts with a small, ordinary sound heard thousands of times across America every night. That sound is the hinge between worlds. One world continues to believe she is still somewhere on the road, still alive within reach, still able to walk back under the neon. If this customer turns out badly, the other world, the real one, is already carrying her toward a place where she will have to fight for breath and fail. That is the incident, not one dramatic scene, But the repeated betrayal of ordinary motion, the familiar turned lethal. The transactional turned final, the brief encounter turned burial. And with each repetition, the county moved a little closer to understanding that these were not disappearances caused by drift, bad luck, or street life alone. They were being made deliberately, methodically, by a man who had learned how to turn the vulnerable architecture of the night into a killing field. And still, the most haunting feature of the incident is how quickly the visible world sealed over behind it. Once Ridgway drove away from a dump site, he could re-enter ordinary life almost at once. He could pass gas stations, traffic lights, late shift workers, families watching television behind curtains. And no one would see what the night contained. The woman he had killed would remain hidden by geography, weather, and time. Her family would wake into uncertainty rather than confirmed catastrophe. Police, if notified, would begin not with a crime scene already blazing with evidence, but with a missing person report haunted by assumptions. This lag between violence and recognition was his greatest weapon. The incident did not announce itself at the moment of death. It announced itself later through absence, then through recovery. That delay multiplied suffering. It meant there were mothers who made breakfast while trying to ignore certainty, friends who retraced corners, motels, parking lots, and diners, asking if anyone had seen her, detectives who could not yet know whether they were dealing with one missing woman, several disconnected cases, or the widening perimeter of a serial predator. In that interval, hope and horror occupied the same room. And every time that happened, Ridgway gained another fragment of confidence. He had done it again. The road had swallowed the evidence again. The woman had disappeared into the gray seam where so many others had gone, so Part 4 ends not with closure, because there was none, but with the expanding echo of the incident across the county. One car door closing in the rain, headlights leaving the strip. One woman erased from night, then another. Then another. The pattern was still forming. But the violence was complete, intimate, far beyond coincidence. The county had not yet caught up to the darkness moving through it. The discovery did not come as a single cinematic revelation with one detective kneeling beside one unmistakable clue while the whole case suddenly sharpened into focus. It came in pieces, in damp earth and underbrush, in the sickening rhythm of search and recovery. In moments when people entered a place expecting to find nothing, and instead found the evidence of repeated human ruin. That is how the crime scene of the Green River murders first imposed itself on King County. Not as one isolated location, but as a spreading geography of death. A series of sites connected less by obvious drama than by their dreadful practicality. The places where bodies were found were often the sort of places most people drove past without seeing at all. Embankments near roads, patches of brush behind industrial areas, wooded clearings, riverbanks, overgrown slopes where blackberry vines snagged clothing and the ground stayed wet beneath a skin of leaves and mud. In daylight, these areas could seem merely neglected. In the context of the investigation, they became something far worse. They became storage. They became evidence that a killer was not only taking women, but transporting them, placing them, arranging their disappearance inside the very folds of the landscape. The first bodies found near the Green River changed everything because they transformed absence into physical fact. A missing woman leaves room for hope no matter how irrational. A body closes one door and opens another, darker one. It forces the mind away from maybe she left, maybe she will call, maybe she is hiding, and toward the unbearable certainty that someone ended a life and left it here. For searchers, that realization was not abstract. It had texture, it had smell, it had weather. Imagine a search party moving through rough ground after reports or rumors had directed them to an area near the river. Boots sank slightly in soft soil, branches scraped sleeves. The river moved nearby with that muted northwest heaviness, not loud, not dramatic, just present, carrying cold through the air. There was the odor of wet vegetation, mud, industrial runoff. Perhaps the faint exhaust from traffic not far away. Then another smell began to emerge. Sweeter and fouler, unmistakable once recognized. People who work death scenes often say that the body declares itself before the eye confirms it, and that truth hung over the Green River sites. By the time a shape was seen beneath brush or among debris, the human nervous system already knew something was wrong. Those first discoveries did more than launch a homicide investigation. They altered the emotional map of the county. The Green River itself, once just part of the working terrain, became linked in public consciousness to the idea of women discarded like waste. That transformation carried a terrible symbolic power. Waterways often suggest movement, cleansing, continuity. Here the river became associated with stillness and concealment, with the brutal fact that multiple young women had been brought to its edges and left there. For detectives, each discovery raised immediate questions. Was this where the killing occurred or only where the body was dumped? Had the victim been placed there recently or months earlier? Was the killer returning to familiar ground? Were these sites chosen for privacy, convenience, ritual, or all three? Search work became a grim discipline of reading terrain, not just as environment, but as intention. A clump of brush was no longer just brush. It might be cover. A turnoff from a road was not just access. It might be a route the killer trusted, the physical crime scene. In other words, extended beyond the body. It included the logic of the site itself. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Green River discoveries was how ordinary the surrounding spaces often were. The county did not contain some hidden Gothic wilderness where evil naturally belonged. These were marginal places adjacent to ordinary movement, near roads people used, near areas shaped by industry, labor, and daily life. That proximity deepened the horror. The killer had learned to exploit the neglected edges of an inhabited world. Not some fantastical realm apart from it. The bodies, when found, were often in various stages of decomposition, making identification and precise interpretation difficult. That difficulty mattered immensely. Families waiting for news lived under the torment of uncertainty while investigators worked through forensic steps that could not be hurried without risking error. Clothing, jewelry, dental records, skeletal features, hair, and personal effects became crucial. A small item discovered near remains could carry enormous emotional and evidentiary weight. A pair of jeans, a piece of fabric, a shoe, a necklace, a strand of hair. Each object might be the thin bridge between anonymous death and a name. And every time a name was attached, a family's suspended dread hardened into grief. Yet even then the discovery was incomplete, because many families had to confront not a whole body they could recognize and mourn in some traditional sense, but remains recovered from a landscape that had already worked against them. Time, weather, animals, and exposure had all intervened. The riverbank, the woods, the embankment were not passive backdrops. They were active accomplices in erasure. Detectives and forensic personnel did what they could against those conditions. But nature had already begun to take evidence away. That is what made the initial clues so precious and so fragile. Any sign preserved at a dump site had to be read carefully. Tire marks, if present, could vanish quickly in rain or mud. Footwear impressions could blur. Fibers could cling to vegetation. Objects left with or near the body might indicate whether the victim had been killed elsewhere and moved, whether there had been struggle at the site, whether the killer had returned. Even the positioning of remains could matter. Though interpretation always carried limits, this was not the clean laboratory version of investigation. It was fieldwork in difficult terrain, under the pressure of public fear and growing evidence that the murders were linked. What began to distinguish the Green River case from a series of tragic but unrelated homicides was not a dramatic signature carved into one scene. It was patterned through accumulation. Multiple female victims, similar victim profiles. Outdoor disposal sites, geographic clustering. Bodies found in relative proximity near the river and in other concealed areas. Every new recovery widened the outline. Investigators were no longer looking at isolated violence. They were looking at repetition. And repetition changed the emotional quality of each discovery. The first body is a shock. The second introduces pattern. The third and fourth begin to feel like a sentence being written in the same hand across the landscape. Soon the search itself becomes haunted by anticipation. People stepping into undergrowth are no longer merely checking a lead. They are bracing for the possibility that one body may lead them to another. In the Green River case, that fear was justified. Some areas yielded multiple victims, turning the act of discovery into something almost unbearable. One find did not resolve the horror. It deepened it. A detective might arrive hoping to process a single scene and end the day realizing he was standing at the edge of something far larger. A cluster of deaths that suggested the killer was revisiting or reusing ground with chilling confidence. That practical confidence was, in itself, an early clue to the offender's psychology. Whoever was doing this knew the county well enough to select places where bodies could remain hidden. He was comfortable moving through these zones. He understood how the environment degraded evidence. He also appeared to understand that victims coming from marginalized backgrounds would not always trigger immediate, expansive search efforts. The crime scene told investigators not only about the murders, but about the killer's relationship to invisibility. He was exploiting the county's overlooked spaces just as he exploited its overlooked people. That connection became central to the case. It is important, too, to remember the human atmosphere surrounding these discoveries. News traveled fast in fragments. A body found near the Green River, possible link to missing women. Search crews back in the area, families who had been clinging to uncertainty suddenly found every update unbearable. Mothers and fathers listened for details they feared hearing. Friends on the street exchanged rumors before police could confirm facts. Sex workers working the strip absorbed each discovery not as distant news, but as an intimate warning. The river was no longer just a place. It was a message. Someone was killing women like them and leaving them where the county had not been looking closely enough. Fear became more disciplined after the discoveries. Not less panic exactly, but more knowledge. Women began to understand that the danger was not random in the loose sense. It had shape. It had intent. It had a geography for law enforcement. The discoveries brought logistical problems as well as emotional urgency. A case of this scale required coordination. Records, comparisons, maps, timelines, victimology, and the exhausting effort of connecting reports that might once have seemed separate. Search areas had to be expanded. Missing persons files had to be revisited. Interviews had to be conducted with families, friends, other sex workers, pimps, boyfriends, motel staff, and anyone else who might clarify last sightings or common customer patterns. Yet all of that came after the immediate violence of the recovery scene itself. The moment when evidence personnel knelt in mud and leaves and confronted the physical aftermath of a murder no one had interrupted. Crime scenes and popular storytelling often emphasize clever clues. The dramatic object that cracks the case. The Green River scenes were more brutal in their realism. The central clue was the body. The body said a woman had been silenced and concealed. The body said someone had carried her here. The body said this had happened more than once. Beyond that, the clues were often partial, weathered, and stubbornly resistant to certainty. But even partial clues can shape an investigation if they repeat. A body found near another body. Similar dump environments, similar victim profiles, similar forms of disappearance. The pattern itself became evidence. And as the recoveries continued, the case gathered an almost geological dread. Layer upon layer of dead laid into the terrain. There is also the question of what the killer intended the dump sites to do psychologically. Was he simply disposing of evidence in efficient locations, or was there some gratification in revisiting the sites? in knowing where the bodies lay while the rest of the county remained ignorant. Later understanding of Ridgway would suggest a mind both practical and deeply warped. A man capable of deriving power from the knowledge that he could move through normal life, while women he had killed decomposed in hidden clusters not far away. The discovery phase hinted at that duality even before investigators knew his name. These were not random panicked disposals made by someone terrified after a first offense. The sites suggested method, familiarity, and a growing boldness. Boldness matters because it often increases with success. Every day a body remained undiscovered was, from the killer's perspective, proof that his choices were working. Every delayed identification, every uncertain timeline, every additional victim found in the same broad zones meant he had been right about the county's blind spots. That knowledge would have intensified the urgency investigators felt standing at those scenes. They were not only processing the dead, they were racing against a living offender who had already learned too much from getting away with it. And still, for all the maps and forensic procedures, the discovery always came back to something simpler and more devastating. A human being had been left outdoors like refuse. Searchers had to move carefully, professionally. But no amount of professionalism erased the emotional charge of that fact. The women found near the river or in wooded sites were not abstractions when their remains were lifted from earth and brush. They were daughters returned in the worst possible way. The scene carried the violence forward into everyone who touched it. Detectives went home with the smell still in their clothes. Families waited for official confirmation that would rearrange the rest of their lives. Women still working the highway saw in each discovery the outline of their own mortality. The county itself began to feel contaminated. Not physically, perhaps, but morally. As though too much had been hidden in plain sight. The crime scene, then, was not one rectangle of taped-off ground. It was an expanding moral landscape. It included the riverbank, the roadside, the woods, the evidence lab, the family kitchen where identification would be received, the motel corridor where the last sighting was discussed, the police board where photographs accumulated. The initial clues were not enough to solve the case immediately, but they were enough to reveal its scale. That revelation was the true discovery. The county was not dealing with misfortune or coincidence. It was dealing with a killer who had created a system of disappearance and disposal. Once that became clear, every patch of brush along certain roads began to look different. Every secluded turnout hinted at possibility. Search teams no longer entered those areas innocent of what they might find. They entered with dread already formed. And in that shift from isolated horror to recognized pattern, the Green River case fully became what history would remember. Not simply a series of murders, but a prolonged confrontation between hidden death and the labor of bringing it, piece by piece, into the light. By the time investigators understood that the Green River murders were not a loose collection of disappearances and body recoveries, but the work of a serial killer moving with confidence through King County, the investigation had already become something vast, exhausting, and psychologically corrosive. Part 6 belongs to that phase, the phase when every answer seemed to generate 10 more questions. When detectives built mountains of paperwork only to watch certainty slip away again. When the killer's very ordinariness made him harder to isolate than the public imagined. The investigation did not unfold like a clean sequence of clues leading steadily toward one inevitable name. It sprawled. It doubled back on itself. It consumed manpower, time, memory, and hope. Detectives chased rumors through rain and fluorescent office light, drove the strip at night, interviewed women who distrusted police for good reason, sat in family living rooms where grief had curdled into frustration, and stared at maps so often that roads and dump sites began to burn themselves into the mind. They were not only hunting a murderer, they were trying to think inside an ecosystem of fear, transience, damaged witness memory, and social neglect that blurred almost every edge of the case. In the public imagination, serial murder investigations often become games of brilliant deduction. In real life, they are often wars of attrition. The Green River case was one of the clearest examples. As more victims were identified or linked, the task force had to construct not just a suspect list, but a whole architecture of the killer's world. They studied the victims' routines, their known associates, their work areas, their last sightings, their nicknames, their boyfriends, pimps, customers, habits, and the fragile chains of rumor that followed any disappearance in the sex trade. The problem was not a lack of information. It was an overgrowth of partial information. Too much of it unstable. One witness remembered a pickup truck. Another swore it had been a sedan. One woman recalled a man who looked nervous and soft-spoken. Another remembered a man who seemed almost aggressively normal. Names surfaced and dissolved. Plates were half remembered. Faces repeated in imagination until they no longer felt reliable. The strip itself was a moving theater of strangers. Men came and went nightly. Women changed corners, motels, and companions. A last sighting that seemed solid in the morning could become uncertain by evening. And over all of it hung the weather, the geography, and the passage of time, each helping the killer keep the truth disassembled. Investigators responded the only way they could. They widened the net. Thousands of names entered the orbit of suspicion. Detectives interviewed an enormous range of men who had contact with sex workers. Men with violence in their histories. Men seen repeatedly near the victims. Men who fit fragments of descriptions. Men turned in by wives, girlfriends, ex-lovers, co-workers, neighbors, or frightened acquaintances. Some tips were practical and specific. Others were born from panic, in a case this visible. The public does not merely observe, it participates, often in ways that help and hinder at once. Every odd man became imaginable as a killer. Every rumor acquired voltage. Investigators had to sort instinct from evidence, obsession from fact, fear from pattern. That sorting process is one of the least glamorous and most punishing elements of detective work. Hours disappeared into interviews that led nowhere. Surveillance consumed resources. Polygraphs were administered. Background checks multiplied. Vehicles were examined. Alibis were probed, broken, patched, and revisited. Meanwhile, bodies continued to be found. And with each discovery, the pressure on the task force deepened. The county wanted a face. The families wanted an arrest. The women still working the highway wanted the nightmare interrupted before they became part of it. But investigations do not move at the speed of terror. They move at the speed of what can be supported. And in the Green River case, support was maddeningly elusive. The killer had chosen victims whose daily lives were already difficult to reconstruct in precise chronology. Many moved between addresses or had no stable address at all. Some used aliases. Some were estranged from family. Some trusted dangerous men and distrusted safer ones. Some disappeared after being seen with customers so ordinary that they barely registered in memory. That made victimology crucial, but also heartbreaking. Detectives trying to build the final days of a missing woman's life often had to navigate a world where trauma had already scrambled relationships. A mother might know her daughter's childhood in intimate detail and know almost nothing about her last month. A friend on the street might know the last month and nothing that came before. A boyfriend might lie for reasons unrelated to murder. A pimp might hide information out of self-protection. A fellow sex worker might sincerely want to help and still misremember details because every night blurred into the next under the same rain and headlights. The investigation became a giant act of reconstruction carried out on a stage that never stopped shifting. The list of suspects grew accordingly, and with growth came dead ends. Some men looked promising because they had violent records and access to the victim pool. Some seemed promising because witnesses had independently described them. Others attracted attention because their behavior after the murders drew scrutiny. Sudden moves, strange comments, odd fixations on the case, an inappropriate interest in police procedure. Yet suspicion is not proof. And many of the most plausible leads dissolved under closer examination. One man might have had a record of assault but no connection to the crucial times or places. Another might have frequented the strip but be reliably accounted for. Another might simply have been one more frightening man in a frightening landscape. Dangerous in his own way, but not the one leaving women in the woods. Cases like this expose a brutal truth about human environments. There is never just one predator. There are many. The difficulty lies in finding the one whose pattern fits the buried shape of the murders. The Green River investigation confronted that reality constantly. It was not searching a county of innocence for one stain. It was searching a county where violence against women already existed in many forms. Where exploitation was common, where coercion and battery and rape and intimidation lived close to the same roads the victims walked. That made the killer both more distinct and harder to isolate. He was unusual in scale. But he was operating within a culture of everyday harm. Detectives also had to confront their own institutional limitations. Law enforcement in the early 1980s did not possess the forensic reach later generations would consider basic. DNA. A science was not yet the mature evidentiary force it would become. Much depended on witness work, geographic patterning, behavioral analysis, serology, fibers, hairs, and the patient linking of cases through human effort. Physical evidence mattered enormously. But evidence cannot solve a case if it cannot be interpreted or compared at the necessary level. The task force did what it could with what it had. And what it had was often frustratingly incomplete, weather-degraded scenes, outdoor disposal sites, scattered traces, time chewed away at recollection. The killer's method, intimate killing followed by strategic dumping, was grimly efficient from an investigative standpoint. He reduced witnesses at the point of death and shifted the body into spaces where the environment helped him. That is why the suspect phase feels so claustrophobic in hindsight. Detectives were pursuing a man who kept forcing the case into uncertainty, then disappearing back into ordinary life. Behavioral profilers entered the picture as the scale of the murders became undeniable. The public tends to romanticize profiling, as though it produces a near mystical image of the killer. In reality, profile work is more limited and more suggestive than final. It can shape priorities, suggest likely traits, and help narrow emphasis, but it cannot replace evidence. In the Green River case, the broad image that emerged was of a man who probably knew the area well, felt comfortable approaching sex workers, possessed a capacity for normal presentation, and was likely driven by a need for control more than spectacle. That description was useful, but it did not single out one person in a county full of ordinary-looking men. In some ways, it widened the unease. If the killer was not flamboyant, not chaotic in public, not obviously deranged, then he could be almost anyone. That possibility haunted the investigation. Detectives were not just chasing men who looked monstrous. They had to consider men who looked forgettable. One of the most important suspect developments of the era involved Gary Ridgway himself, who came to police attention during the investigation and was interviewed relatively early. That fact has become one of the most unsettling elements of the case in retrospect. The killer was not some unheard-of phantom beyond the reach of procedure. He crossed into the investigative field and still slipped away. At the time, however, the case against him was not yet complete enough to hold. He had reasons to be scrutinized. He frequented the areas where victims worked. He had contact with sex workers. There were concerns about his behavior, yet concern is not the same as prosecutable certainty. And certainty was the one thing the task force never had enough of during these middle years. Ridgway could appear dull rather than alarming. He was not a dramatic personality who overwhelmed a room in a strange way. That helped him. Investigators working under pressure can be drawn toward the suspect who radiates menace, the man who seems to fit the story emotionally. Ridgway often seems to fit it only partially. And partial fit in a giant suspect pool can be fatal to progress. Other suspects also absorbed enormous attention. Some were pursued so intensely that whole lines of inquiry bent around them for a time. The logic was understandable. A credible suspect in a serial murder case is difficult to ignore, especially when tips converge or some detail appears to align with witness statements. But the cost of these intense suspect phases is that they consume emotional energy and create the illusion of closeness. Detectives begin to feel that one more interview, one more search, one more test may finally break the case. Then it does not. The suspect remains disturbing but unchargeable, or collapses entirely under evidentiary review, and the investigation has to inhale, reset, and begin widening again. That cycle can wear people down in ways outsiders rarely see. It produces impatience, tunnel vision, second guessing, and private dread that the killer is learning from every failure. In the Green River case, all of those pressures were present. Meanwhile, the public narrative around the murders evolved into a strange mix of fear and morbid familiarity. The case became famous while still unsolved, and fame itself complicates policing. Witnesses begin to absorb media details into memory. Tipsters shape their stories around what they have heard. Detectives become aware that every misstep may become public. Families feel both grateful for attention and wounded by the way attention can flatten loved ones into symbols. Women still working the strip lived with the practical consequences. The investigation was not some distant institutional drama to them. It was a question of whether any man slowing beside them might be the one police had failed to identify again. That atmosphere generated its own dead ends. Women reported suspicious customers. Some reports were invaluable. Others described men who were merely part of the endless background of exploitation surrounding the case. Sorting the truly predatory from the generally dangerous became one of the investigation's cruelest recurring tasks. Sometimes the wrong man looked right because the right man had learned how not to stand out. There is also a psychological trap in serial killer investigations. The hope that the offender's mind will reveal itself through some brilliant irregularity, some signature so personal it points like an arrow. Ridgway's case resisted that kind of romantic clarity. His pattern lay not in theatrical display, but in repetition, victim selection, and disposal habits. He did not seem driven by a need to impress the public with symbolic messages. He was driven by domination and concealment. That made him less visible to the imagination. A taunting killer becomes memorable. A practical killer becomes background. Detectives had to fight that background effect constantly.